Blessed is he that readeth, and they that hear the words of this prophecy, and keep those things that are written therein, for the time is at hand.
Welcome to Word on the Street, where we bring you hot topics. Today we're going to go through this book called Ukraine, an Illustrated History. And in this book we're going to go to the chapter regarding... Now, I made a video regarding the Khazars, which is chapter 4, but today we're going to go into chapter 16, which is Tartars and Cossacks. Now, we're going to take a look of these particular tribe in Ukraine, and how does it line up to what's going on today. The next video I'm going to do on this series will be regarding Galatia, which is the same Galatia found in the Bible. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and get into the content.
This force was Tatars and Cossacks b. the 14th century, while Lithuanian and Polish rule was being established in central and western Ukrainian lands. The southern steppe region and the Crimea were undergoing political change. The Mongolo-Tatar Golden Horde was weakened after 1357 by 2 decades of internal strife and then, in the 1390s, by the efforts of Tamerlane to rule the entire Mongol Empire. As a result, during the first half of the 15th century, 2 new Tatar Khanates were carved out of the Golden Horde's territory, the Crimean Khanate in the west and the Kazan Khanate in the north. Finally, in 1502 the Golden Horde itself ceased to exist and its heartland on the lower Volga River was transformed into the Astrakhan Khanate. The 3 Khanates were formidable military powers and each continued the Golden Horde's practice of demanding tribute from Muscovy. The Crimean Khanate, which had a direct impact on Ukrainian lands, was under the rule of the Giray dynasty, whose capitals were first at Krym, later renamed Eski Karim. J. Subay Yukoy and Day Q copyright JYY Buletinadu, 17, equals Subyo IYOS, Chi. I backs, Yubwoho 4, Soy, L underscore, today's Durai IKRYM, and from the 15th century at Bakkazare/Bossazare. In contrast to the Golden Horde, the Crimean Tatar rulers were at times positively and at others negatively inclined toward Italianate, Genos and Venetian, control of the Crimean coastal regions. But it was the Ottoman conqueror of Constantinople, Sultan Mehmed II, R 1451–1481, who was the decisive factor in Crimean affairs. Determined to make the Black Sea into an Ottoman lake, he managed in 1475 to remove permanently the Genos from the coastal area, which was placed directly under an Ottoman administration. Symbolic of the Italianate decline was the change in place names. Moncastro, today Bilharad Dinastrovs Kyi, became Turkish Kerman/Aq Kerman, Tana, today Azov, became Azak, and Kaffa, today Feodosia, the most important Crimean port city, became Kiev. Under Ottoman rule, Kiev's port was expanded and its population increased to such an extent that by the early 17th century it was one of the largest sites in Eastern Europe. The Ottomans eventually recognized the Giray dynasty, and although the Crimean Khanate was formally a vassal state, it remained only loosely subordinate to the Ottoman Empire and effectively functioned as an independent state. The Crimean Khanate included not only the Crimean Peninsula, subdivided into 2 distinct parts, the lowland Srrrns, Tatars and Cossacks 83 No. 1 SS, EEIAPR Srais Rataidu, 16.2 battle between the Ottoman Turks and Crimean Tatars for control of Kaffa/Kiev, from an Ottoman manuscript, 1586. Steppe and the mountains along the southern coast, but also the steppe lands beyond the Periko Isthmus that stretch from the mouth of the Dnieper River eastward all around the shores of the Sea of Azov to the Kuban region. This vast, sparsely settled territory was basically divided into 2 regions, the peninsula, including its steppe lands, and the steppe lands farther north. The sedentary Giray rulers based in Bakkazare and the Tatar tribal clans allied with them controlled most of the Crimean peninsula. As for the steppe lands farther north of the peninsula, they were after the mid-16th century the domain of nomadic Nogay tribes, originally from the lower Volga Valley, who were nominally subordinate to but more often independent of Crimean authority. These various Nogay tribes, Kuban, Yedikul, Yamboyluk, Yedisan, Bugak, supplied the greatest number of Tatars most directly involved in Ukrainian lands. Despite their tenuous and often problematic relationship with the Crimean Khanate, the Nogays fulfilled for that state a quite useful purpose. Their presence prevented the establishment of Slavic settlements in the steppe, and they provided the Crimean and Ottoman markets with a steady supply of its most important commodity, slaves. Captured slaves from Ukrainian lands functioned at all levels of Ottoman society, from agricultural workers and house servants to galley slaves and soldiers in the imperial army and navy, advisors and government officials, and in the case of women as prized members of the harems of wealthy nobles and the imperial court. Among the best-known captives destined for the imperial harem was Nastia Lisovska, the daughter of a priest in Rohatan, far western Ukraine, who was abducted in 1520. As the legendary Roxolana, she became the only wife and political consultant of Sultan Stilaman I, the Magnificent, r. 1520–1556. In short, the Crimean export trade, and therefore its economic well-being, was based primarily on the slave trade. The Crimean rulers and merchants acted as middlemen, processing the slaves that they bought from the Nogay and Tatar raiders and then reselling them to buyers from the Ottoman Empire. The main source for the Nogay slave trade were Slavs captured mostly north of the open steppe in central and western Ukraine. Beginning in the 1470s and continuing to the end of the 17th century, the Nogay Tatars undertook annual slave raids along fixed routes that brought them to the southern Kiev, Brat, Slav, Podolaya, and Galicia Palatinates. Because of the Nogay and Tatar danger, the southern frontier regions of Ukraine became a kind of no man's land. These were the proverbial wild fields, Dziki Pole, in contemporary Polish writings, which separated Poland-Lithuania from the Crimean Khanate. The wild fields were at the same time a naturally rich and fertile region teeming, as contemporary documents recall, with cattle, wild animals, and fish. Consequently, as early as the 15th century 16.3 Crimean Tatar town dwellers at rest. A few individuals ventured into the wild fields on short-term expeditions to acquire the region's natural wealth. It was not long before the number of travelers to Ukraine's wilderness increased. This mode of existence, farming, hunting, then returning home in the winter or perhaps remaining permanently, came to be known as the Cossack way of life. In order to deal with the ever-present danger of Nogay slave raiders, the mostly Rus Ukrainian peasants and townspeople turned Fron 16.4 a Nogay Tatar mobile residents on the open Tver dwellers were by circumstance steppe forced to become skilled in the art of self-defense. With their new skills, some began to turn on the offensive, attacking Nogay slave raiding parties and Tatar trade caravans. It was not long before the frontier dwellers formed small armed bands to attack Ottoman commercial centers in the Crimea, Moldavia, and Wallachia. The very word Cossack, derived from the Turkish term Gazak, meaning freebooting warrior or raider, was first applied to Tatar renegades from the Crimean Khanate who were hired to fight for Muscovy and Lithuania. Despite its origins, the term Gazak/Cossack was before long associated with those frontier dwellers, primarily Slavs but including all others who were opposed to the Tatar enemy. As early as the second half of the 15th century, Cossacks were being hired by Lithuanian officials from Ukraine's frontier palatinates and districts in order to help defend the Grand Duchy's southern border. Because they were stationed in frontier settlements like Cherkasy, Chyhryn, and Bratslav, these forces were known as town Cossacks. For a while the group as a whole was called Cherkasy, after the fortified town along the Dnieper River south of Kiev, where they concentrated in largest numbers. The town Cossacks, officially recognized because 16.5 Roxolana, 1505–1558, wife of the Ottoman Sultan Süleyman Kanuni, as depicted in a 17th century engraving. Of their service to the Lithuanian and later Polish authorities, were in the course of the 16th century employed more and more frequently by powerful Rus magnates in Ukraine and by Poland's kings. Beginning in 1572, the king introduced the system of a register, whose rolls began with 300 Cossacks. Subsequently, the number of registered Cossacks, depending on political and military conditions in Poland-Lithuania, was to fluctuate during the first half of the 17th century from a high of 20,000 in 1620 to a low of 6,000 in 1638. In return for their services, the registered Cossacks, drawn primarily from well-to-do town Cossacks, were granted what later became known as traditional liberties. These included the right to own land and to pass it on to their offspring, exemption from taxes and from local Polish authorities, and effective self-government under a leader, starshii, appointed by the government from among Cossack ranks. The registered Cossacks, officially known as the Army of Zaporozhia, even though they did not reside in Zaporozhia proper, were given the town of Trachtimiriv and its monastery as their permanent headquarters. In essence, the registered Cossacks became property holders with a vested interest in maintaining social stability within Poland-Lithuania. In contrast to the town and registered Cossacks were those Cossacks who lived farther south, away from Polish-Lithuanian authority and beyond the rapids located about halfway between the First and Sec. On great bends of the Dnieper River. It was from this geographic concept beyond the rapids, Ukrainian, Zaporozhye, that the regional name Zaporozhia and the group name Zaporozhian Cossacks derives. Zaporozhia became a haven for dissatisfied townspeople, for ever larger numbers of peasants wanting to flee the increasing burdens of Poland's monoreal system and the reintroduction of serfdom, and for a host of other adventurers of various social backgrounds who simply wished to live beyond the reach of existing government control. In terms of 16.6 officers among the town, or regici, tiered Cossacks, ethnicity, the vast majority were Slavs, in particular ancestors of modern-day Ukrainians, although there were also Romanians/Moldavians, Tatars, Turks, and Jews who sought refuge in Zaporozhia. The center of Zaporozhian Cossack life was a fortified center known as the Sich, see Chapter 17. Despite their rejection of governmental authority and their scorn for town Cossacks who were formally registered, the Zaporozhian Cossacks also served the Polish king from time to time, especially when he needed large numbers of troops to protect or extend the Commonwealth's frontiers. The Zaporozhians served as well under registered Cossack leaders, or hetmans, when they felt it was in their interests to do so. Like the Crimean Khanate, which had difficulty in controlling its Nogai Tatars, so too did Poland-Lithuania have little control over the actions of its Zaporozhian Cossacks. The Zaporozhians were particularly fond of carrying out sea raids against towns and landed estates in the Crimean Khanate and in Ottoman territories all along the shores of the Black Sea, in some cases reaching as far as the outskirts of the latter's capital, Istanbul. These acts provoked reprisals on the part of the Ottoman authorities, with the result that the first half of the 17th century witnessed a seemingly unbreakable cycle of actions and counteractions. The Zaporozhian Cossacks would raid the Crimea and Ottoman Empire, the Ottomans would retaliate with threats and at times would invade Poland-Lithuania. The Commonwealth's authorities would demand that the Zaporozhians cease their anti-Ottoman and anti-Crimean raids and would send punitive expeditions to intervene in Zaporozhian affairs. The Zaporozhians would rebel against this interference, and often fierce battles with Polish armies would result. In the end, nothing decisive ever occurred, and the 16.7a Zaporozhian Cossack in military cycle would be repeated all over again. The repetitive cycle did, however, produce much bloodshed. This was particularly the case during two major Polish-Ottoman battles in Moldavia, at Tartaria/Sikora in 1620, won by the Ottomans and Crimean Tatars, and at Kotin in 1621, won by Poland-Lithuania with the aid of registered Zaporozhian Cossacks. As for the Polish-Zaporozhian clashes, These were most widespread during 7 uprisings led by Krzysztof Kosinski (1591–1593), Severin Nalivaiko and Hryhory Loboda (1594–1596), Marcos Melo (1625), Taras Fedorovic (1630), Ivan Sulima (1635), Pavlo Pavliukbut and Dimitro Hunia 1637, and Lakov Ostrianin 1638. Following the failure of the last of these revolts in 1638, the unregistered Cossacks of 4 Fimipnei Renac in Zaporozhia were all declared outlaws. 2s formally outlaws or not, Poland's military establishment almost without exception considered the Cossacks of Zaporozhia and their peasant followers to be social outcasts and dealt with them as such on the battlefield. Consequently, the treatment meted out by Poles to captured Zaporozhye in 16.8 Zaporozhian Cossacks not only operated on land but also took to the sea, as depicted in this engraving, 1622, of their attacks against the Crimean port of Kiev / Cossacks and by Cossacks to captured Poles, and in particular to their registered Cossack allies, was often brutal. In short, a deep-seated hatred and distrust developed on both sides between Zaporozhian Cossacks and Poles, something which was later depicted with great insight in the popular 19th century novel by Nikolai Gogol, Tsar's Bulba. In the end, however, neither the registered Cossacks nor even unregistered Cossacks ever really questioned the premise that they were subjects of the Polish king. They simply wanted to be granted a special status within the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth, whether recognition as a distinct social estate for the registered Cossacks or non-interference in Zaporozhia for the unregistered Cossacks. During the first half of the 17th century, the Cossacks took on an additional role. 16.9 Zaporozhian Cossack military camp during a land campaign. They came to be viewed and they viewed themselves as defenders of orthodoxy. In short, the Orthodox Rus with their Cossack defenders were pitted against Roman Catholic Poles and the Western-oriented Rus Uniats in a struggle that concerned not only social and administrative rights and privileges but also cultural values and, in this pre-national age, group identity. Crucial to this process was the activity of Petro Sahedekny, hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks and the hero in Poland's victory against the Ottoman Turks at the 1621 Battle of Khotin. Taking advantage of his prestige in Polish society, Sahedekny pressed the Commonwealth to recognize the Orthodox hierarchy, secretly elected in 1620, and he enrolled all his Cossacks in the newly established Orthodox Kiev Brotherhood. For their part, the church hierarchs recognized the historic mission of the Cossacks Napaltika and considered the army of Zaporozhia, in K/Nagatka in the words of Orthodox Metropolitan Lov Boritz Kyi, R. 1620–1631, as descendants of the glorious Rus, who more than any others in the whole world do so much for the benefit of persecuted and oppressed Orthodox Christians. Certainly, by the mid-17th century the Cossacks had become for the Rus, Ukrainian and Belarusian, populace of Poland-Lithuania the symbolic and real defenders of the Orthodox faith and identity. 16.10 Petro Konashevich Sahedekny, ca. 1570–1622, hetman of the Zaporozhian Cossacks from 1614 until his death, as depicted in a contemporary engraving.
So the Lord said, who will rise up against me, against the evildoers, man? Right. So our job is to come out and to rebuke it, man. Alright, to pull our people out of the fire, to warn you, man. To blow up the trumpet, that you're living in the last days, man. That fire is going to come and burn America up off the face of the earth, man. Shema Mashiach Yahushai, man. Alright, and how is that going to happen? These things are going to happen through the awakening of the 12 tribes of the children of Israel. Right. This is the biggest fear of your enemies, man. The so-called white men in the nations, they are all confederate against you. Right. To keep you asleep. Okay, keep you from knowing the truth, man. Alright, but the truth is out, man. Nothing can stop it. Read this. This is the book of Jeremiah, chapter 28, verse 8. No. The prophets that have been before me, of old prophesied both against many countries and against great kingdoms of war. So our job is to prophesy war, man. Alright, the Lord is raising us up in these last days, man, to prophesy of wars. Okay, so we talk about the wars that are coming, man. There's a war that is going to start that you're going to need a higher power to deliver you from. Right. It will be impossible for you to survive thermonuclear fire without the Most High God, man, and His Son. And the Lord has set it up that way. That's why it is very important for you so-called blacks, Hispanics, and Mexican Indians to repent and come out of America, man. Turn from your evil deeds and your wickedness, man. Repent, save your life, man. Come on. End of evil, end of pestilence, end of evil and pestilence. And the Lord said, if our people don't repent, they're surely going to perish. Now, we can tell you how it's going to happen. And the Lord said you're going to be burnt up, man. Right? You're going to die horrible deaths, man. And you go to 2nd Ezra, man, the 16th chapter, man. And everybody's not going to die in the lake of fire, man. And some people going to starve out, man. Some people going to get stabbed to death, man. Right? Some people going to watch their children die, man. Right? Some people going to eat their children, man. And then they're going to get eaten, man. Right? Women are going to be getting raped in the streets, man. Your police force is going away, man. Your stores are going to be closed, man. Who are you going to call? Who's going to save you then, man? It's not going to be no more drugs, man. You won't have access to cigarettes, man. There won't be no bars open, man, in that day, man. America is going to completely shut down, man. Famine is coming into the land, man. Death, destruction, man. Read it. Verse 9. The prophet which prophesied of peace, but the word of the prophet shall come to pass. Then shall the prophet be known that the Lord hath truly sent him. Now, in these days coming up, we have to understand too, as men of the Lord, man, what does that mean for us? You have to endure, man. You have to be serious about this truth, man. You gotta gird up your loins in these last days, man. Prayer and fasting should be at an all-time high, man. Straight up, man. If you're not praying and fasting, man, I'm telling you right now, you're not gonna make it, man. Alright, unless the Lord be alive, man. And the Lord said they don't need to fast while the groom is with them, man. But those days shall come when the groom is not with them, and they shall fast many days, man. Right, read this, because we filthy, man. We got all type of demons and all type of wickedness that's sown in us, man. And the only way to get it is by prayer and by fasting, man.